So for the final hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about information specific to North Dakota. I have a beautiful picture, telepsychology in North Dakota from the Creative Commons. Okay. And we know you haven't forgotten, but for those joining us via webinar, my name is Dr. Sarah Smucker-Barnwell. I'm a clinical psychologist licensed in the state of Washington. And my great interest is in telehealth, how we can use technology to bring good evidence-based care to clients where they need it. I've had the good fortune of doing this work in a diversity of settings, was one of the founders of the Promoting Access to Telemental Health Group, or PATH service at VA Puget Sound, that uses a diversity of interactive technologies, web, telephone, video conferencing, mobile applications, and others to deliver care to veterans. And now in private practice, in my work currently, see clients typically through video conferencing and telephone.
I'm Dr. Margot Adams-Larson. I'm a licensed psychologist here in North Dakota. I come into this presentation through my interest in the regulatory side of telepractice and partnering with Sarah and several other fantastic colleagues on the telepsychology task force that was put together from APA, ASPPB, and the Trust. And I do a little bit of this work in my office setting, but I primarily am focused on some of the regulatory aspects. So I'm adjunct faculty in the University of North Dakota Department of Psychology and also teaching this semester in the counseling department. Just a couple things as we're getting this section started. One, if you didn't pick up the handouts for it, they are available and we can hand those out. I got this one. The other thing that I have been asked to let you know about, and that is this whole day of workshop counts towards our CE credits that are in law, jurisprudence, and ethics. And so we only need 3 of those in North Dakota, each reporting cycle, but they wanted me to make that announcement to you so that you know all 7 of these hours are actually counting towards that. Or for those on the webinar, the 1. So our agenda today, we're going to cover broadly some federal statutes and rules that you need to be aware of to inform your practice here in North Dakota. We're going to talk specifically about North Dakota statutes, rules, and policies. And we're going to look at some of the aspects of occupational and practice law. We're going to look at the psychology statutes and rules. And we're also going to touch a little bit upon some of the mental health law in our state. We'll do a brief review of some interjurisdictional issues, and we'll talk about some special considerations regarding telepractice within our community. And we'll have some cutting edge details about the compact announcement. So I'll let Sarah take it away.
And a few disclaimers, as we've said in a sort of prognosticating way, whenever you talk about technology, there will be technology problems. We're really here to offer our best practice recommendations based on our clinical experience, our experiences in regulation, our review of the empirical literature, and our consultation with colleagues. This is really intended to be an educational seminar and never a replacement for good legal counsel, consulting with your board, and generally being aware of the considerations specific to your jurisdiction. So we always are asking you, look at your state regulations, consult your own legal counsel, consult with your risk manager, and we're always using our best judgment and our best common sense. So B.F. Skinner, the real problem is not whether machines think, but whether men do. This idea of technology doesn't give us the solutions to sort of our problems as clinicians, but rather facilitates how we disseminate our answers to the problems that exist. So the legal lingo, let's talk a little bit about some definitions. And this actually, I have to say, was very good for me as a general matter. Margot helped me a lot. Thinking about regulation from a legal perspective and making a distinction between law, regulation, and guidelines. Law being those statutes created by our legislature, our legislators who are elected and appointed. Regulations being those rules, often found in an administrative code, which often have the force of law, but are distinct from law. And guidelines, these are the professional conduct or standards of care typically proposed by some of our professional organizations. Consider the guidelines on telepsychology or our ethical guidelines. They're providing us aspirational guidance. You may see it cited in law and ultimately may be discussed by legislators who may or may not be always well apprised of our professional organization's intent. But we do want to make the distinction between these three things. And various agencies develop these rules based on their authority related to the law. So laws can relate to professional titles, can relate to practice and practice environments, to the requirements of reporting, duty to warn, how we do civil commission, how we think about consent, and how we think about the consent of special populations like minors. So what is jurisdiction anyway? We wanted to make the distinction between three types of jurisdiction. We have in-person jurisdiction. Think of a title via a license. So for example, I'm licensed in the state of Washington, and by holding a license, that entity, my board, has jurisdiction over me and over my use, over my practice as a psychologist. I would distinguish this from subject matter jurisdiction. So many of us here today, most of us I believe, are psychologists. Where I'm from in Washington, that's a term of art. You are not a psychologist until you are licensed in psychology. And so were I absent a PhD in psychology and absent a license from the state of Washington to go set up my 5-cent lemonade stand, like Lucy Van Pelt on the sidewalk and say, psychological services, 5 cents a glass, the board might have something to say about that, and in a limited capacity could, sanction me by saying, hey, you're using a term of art. They have jurisdiction, over this subject matter, over this practice of psychology, and they have a duty to protect it. Then we've also spoken a fair bit throughout the day today regarding geographical jurisdiction. So these may be state boundaries, very often, or subject matter boundaries. For example, the distinction between North Dakota's jurisdiction, existing within those boundaries, and for example, going outside the state of North Dakota, so South Dakota. In all of these instances, we're talking about authority by way of license, location, or what you are doing. And this is typically either granted by law or by one of the entities we've discussed that create these regulation or guidelines, enforced by executive branch, state of government, licensing boards, and other entities. Okay. And for me, it was helpful to think about what is the mission of the various organizations making these rules. We have our professional organizations. We have American Psychological Association is a great example. This is a guild organized to support and foster the development of our profession of psychology. And at the heart of its mission, they have its membership. They have the members of APA. They have the profession of psychology, elevating that and continuing its development. They have a commitment to the protection of the profession, to the development of guidelines that help us sort of aspire towards the best practices of our profession and really establishing the best standards of care, helping us really reach to be the best we can be in the practice of our profession. I'd also make the distinction then between insurance providers. Again, they also develop policies to assist us, and they really have an eye towards the legal issues for us as professionals. And they have they're insured at the heart of their mission. And very much, helping manage risk, because certainly when it's bad for the insured, it's bad for the insurance company. They want to be thoughtful about ways that we can practice that will not get us into trouble, that will keep us clear of any type of complaints, litigation, and so forth. So really at the heart of their mission, they have our risk management and helping protect us as providers. And then I would note the licensing boards. Licensing boards are the extension of the government, the promulgation of laws, and really at the heart of their mission is the public. They're there to prevent the public from harm and really making sure that our best practices are carried out and that there's a mechanism of accountability should that not be the case.
So let's talk a little bit about federal statutes and rules. And the first one that I'll mention is HIPAA. We talked a lot about HIPAA. Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act came into effect in 1996 and has had several additions since that time frame, and we will continue to have additions and growth with that as well. High tech, we've mentioned a few times, and high tech is the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act, and that was enacted as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. And that adds a layer and blends into HIPAA related to a lot of the technology practices that we've been talking about today. I mentioned earlier COPPA, the Children's Online Protection, Privacy Protection Act, came into effect in 2000, and this is the law that you want to look to if you have any work that you're doing with kids or your professional website is interesting looking to children. And I say that kind of broadly, but it's kind of vague, and you need to be aware of what some of those requirements are. FTC, the Federal Trade Commission Act, is a consumer protection act, and historically has been one of the founding laws behind some of these other later laws. It came into effect in 1914 and continues to have significant influence in terms of business practice, and particularly trade, which psychologists and other licensed professionals are considered to be one of. Another federal statute that we want to draw your attention to is the Code of Federal Regulations. And in particular, where this impacts us in psychology are for those who are doing work with substance or alcohol abuse and treatment. And 42 CFR Part 2 is what you want to pay particular attention to, as there are very specific requirements related to mental health treatment of these specific diagnoses or populations. So in North Dakota, jurisdictional, and I should mention, we've done this talk in several different states and kind of modify this section so it's very specific to North Dakota for this talk. But we'll talk a little bit in terms of other jurisdictions, because you're going to want to know if you have clients coming from another jurisdiction or traveling to, how to get the same information in that jurisdiction. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in North Dakota, you want to go to the government website. I kind of took a screenshot here and threw it up here. The picture changes, so don't look for the picture. They rotate through all sorts of lovely scenes of North Dakota, and I noticed they were all spring-like at this time of year. I've actually pulled a few when I've done presentations around the country, because they have some nice barren snow ones to show in the winter, all that kind of stuff. But from the government site, you should be able to find some other more particular links for law and regulations. So you can find the Century Code, you can find the Administrative Code, and several other things that'll be helpful. You want to poke around that website. It's kind of cool. When I first got licensed here, way back a long time ago, all this stuff wasn't really accessible on the internet. So it's kind of been nice to see how it transforms and how much easier the access is to this nowadays. Specifically in North Dakota, we have two laws that govern our specific practice of psychology. The statutes, which is the North Dakota Century Code, it's organized by chapter, and there's a couple different sections that you want to pay attention to. The one that you're most familiar with is going to be 4352, which is the chapter on psychologists, and I put in brackets, and applied behavior analysts, because a few years ago we adopted them too. And so if that happens to be one of your areas of practice, you're going to want to pay attention to that aspect. Also, there is another chapter that's probably a little less known to you, and that's chapter 4352, and that's a general chapter about organization or occupations and professions. Has some very interesting information we'll talk about in a bit related to remote practice and telepractice. And that's general to a variety of professions, not just psychology. From those statutes that were enacted by the legislature, they give us authority in Chapter 4352 to promulgate rules. And the licensing board historically has written various rules related to how that law is going to be implemented. And that's found in the North Dakota Administrative Code. That code is organized for all sorts of professions and organizations in North Dakota, and our specific information for psychologists is in Title 66, and it's titled the Board of Psychologist Examiners. One of the things that I want to come back to is this chapter that looks at professions and occupations. And this is a global chapter that includes several different professions. Some are excluded, and that's identified at the start of the law. But it talks about the remote practice of psychology or any profession, as well as foreign providers and license holders practicing within our state, again, in a variety of professions. So one of the things that's important to note here, if you happen to be interested or somebody asks you that they're interested in coming in to do telepsych practice here in North Dakota, is the location of practice of an occupation or profession is defined in our law. And remember, we talked about earlier how the trust has a perspective of where practice occurs. ASPPB has a perspective of where practice occurs. And in our jurisdiction, it's very specific and documented in 435102 about where practice occurs. And it states the provision of services to an individual in this state which fall within the standard of practice of a profession or occupation regulated by a board in our state, regardless of the means in which that service is provided or the location of the person providing the services, constitutes the practice of that profession or occupation in our state. And it's regulated by whatever board of profession it is involved. So that tells us that if you are doing psychological practice, no matter where you're located, if it's occurring and a service recipient is in our state, then it's constituting a practice in our state. So those are things you want to think about. There's discipline related to violating this law, and that's listed in this next section. You want to take a look at that, but I'm not going to scare you today by reading all the purple print. So essentially, you just want to be aware that for folks coming in, they need to have a license and need to be aware of what our jurisdictional requirements are. Back to psychology-specific law, Chapter 4332 is the law in North Dakota that provides authority for the licensing board to regulate the profession of psychology, industrial organizational psychology, and applied behavior analysis. If you look to these kind of laws in other states, you will find it may be specific to psychology. It may be specific to applied behavior analysis in a very separate section of law. So some states, those are two very different laws. And not all the time is IO psychology a licensed profession or a regulated profession across jurisdictions. Our law in North Dakota outlines licensure requirements for practice in North Dakota. That includes educational requirements, supervised practice requirements, the examination requirements in order to become licensed, and then our agreement to abide by the APA Ethics Code of Conduct. And if you happen to do applied behavior analysis, the BACB ethics requirements. Important to note here that APA Ethics Code is not law, it's referred to in our law. And so that's an important distinction you may want to be aware of. This chapter outlines the board structure. Importantly, all of the board members are appointed by a governor. This is not the case in all jurisdictions. And so that is kind of our connection with the executive branch of government. And our authority, or the board's authority, is identified within that chapter and generally looks at licensing, continuing education requirements, renewal requirements, and a disciplinary process. That's fairly standard across different jurisdictions that you will find all of that kind of content within the Practice Act. The rules, as I mentioned, they're located in the administrative code here, and they're identified under Title 66, really identify more detailed how it is that the board carries out that mission or that authority. So there's a lot more detailed information in those rules. They have the same force and same kinds of effect as the law, but they're just a lot more detailed information. You're going to want to be looking at this, kind of a caveat here that I didn't add in at the time we developed this presentation, but the law has recently changed with this legislative session, and so there will be a new law in place shortly. I think it will come into effect. I'm going to rely on Dr. Fair. Is it June that it will be in effect? August 1st? Okay. Summertime. Good reading. You want to take a look at that law. The rules will be obviously quite some time later, but the law will be in effect and we'll all have to be abiding by that. So we'll want to pay attention to some of that. In terms of our rules related to psychology here in North Dakota, we do have some options that may have significance related to telepractice, and that's limited practice without a license. And that's for folks that don't live here, aren't licensed here, but maybe licensed in another state. And this is informed by the Occupations and Professions Law, permitting the practice for someone with a certificate who's informed themselves to the board. They can come in and practice for 30 days if they've been approved by the board. Some practical guidelines that you're going to want to look to, not specifically in telepsychology, but certainly as you're thinking about all of these new ideas and things that are coming along in terms of technology in your practice. And you want to look at the APA, ASPPB, and the trust guidelines and documentations that they have available on their websites. The ATA that we've talked about. Look to that empirical literature. If there's something neat you want to do a search, see what you can find in terms of some of that empirical evidence, and use that to help inform how your practice can be. And always think about how that regulation can be impacting what you're doing in practice. So screenshot, just a capture for what the licensing board home page looks like here. I know when I've given this talk in a variety of places, some people have trouble finding the board websites. And ASPPB is kind of the overarching association of all the licensing boards in states and provinces in North America, and I also think in Puerto Rico. And they have, and Guam, thank you. They have a really nice linking page. If you're looking for a website and can't find it, if you check out the ASPPB.org website, they'll have a link to the other jurisdictions and can help you find that more easily. The North Dakota Licensing Board does have some pages that show related links. Some of those link to the laws in North Dakota and information specific to North Dakota, and some of those link to some of those federal laws that I've just talked about. There's another layer that isn't law. It's not got the effective rule, but it can be informative to your practice from a license and regulatory standpoint. And those tend to fall under the caveat of policy, what's been kind of historically happening. Some of that you can find in meeting minutes. Sometimes boards will have what they call white papers or position statements. In North Dakota, the board the Psychologist Examiners Board tends to put that out. It looks like from a frequently asked questions page, which is certainly a strategy a number of other boards around the country use. So I've put a link here for the North Dakota one, and there is a specific link to telepsychology. And I don't want to spend a lot of detail and time specifically on that, other than to say This is an ongoing process that's probably going to be changing. So this is a place you're going to want to visit and update probably every few months so that you can have the most up-to-date information. So as I mentioned, talking a little bit about how to find this information in other places. Sometimes it's confusing. Some boards are really hard to get a hold of. Some boards work on very minimal, actually most boards work on very minimal funding. And you know, they don't have a lot of web access. They don't have a lot of personnel. You know, that happens to be the case here in North Dakota. We have a half-time volunteer secretary. In Minnesota, they have 10 people in their IT department alone for their psychology board. They have a large number of employees. It's just a matter of population, and around the country that is quite variable. So to help you out, find the government website for whatever jurisdiction you're looking to. Look for statute for occupations and professions, or psychology or counseling, depending what you're looking for. Search for their rules. Some of those are not easy to find, and this is part of my world on a day-to-day basis. So I understand it can be kind of complex. Again, looking to ASPPB to help you navigate some of that is certainly a viable thing to do. If you could find the website for the State Board of Psychologist Examiners, that can help too. You just do a Google search and put the state or jurisdiction in there that you're looking for. Sometimes it pops up that way, but you can't find it because their government doesn't allow a search engine to be readily available. Searching Telepractice with that jurisdiction can also pull up a lot of really helpful information. Again, just like anything on the web, you want to kind of vet that through your clinical judgment process. Is it, you know, some blog by someone that sort of knows what they're doing, or is it somebody official in the government that, you know, is a white paper and giving you some good information? Again, the trust has some fantastic resources that are state specific, and so that's another great place to look for some of this information for other jurisdictions.
A little earlier, someone had asked a question regarding First Nation and tribal communities in the state of North Dakota, and I hope to make mention of one additional point, especially as we start talking about jurisdictional considerations, and that is the research of Dr. Jay Shore. Jay Shore has done a tremendous amount of research looking at, you know, working in tribal communities, using telehealth to do work that is culturally informed and evidence-based. So I thought I'd mention his work as we sort of start talking about this review of interjurisdictional concerns. That would actually be with a sovereign nation, but anytime we're talking about the provision of psychological services using telecommunications technologies across jurisdictional boundaries, we're really talking about an interjurisdictional telepractice. You know, we've spoken a fair bit about this in the past, but we wanted to provide some examples because I think it's relevant. I think this is something that maybe comes into our lives more than we know, especially now that folks are more mobile than ever. You know, we no longer are calling landlines where we know where the other person is seated. We're calling mobile devices where we don't really know where they are. When we shoot an email off, you know, we really don't know where that other person's going to read it. Not to mention, you know, the server that might be facilitating the sending of that email, but thankfully we don't have to think too much about that. So some examples of some interjurisdictional telepractice scenarios that could arise. Example number one, you know, if I'm licensed in one jurisdiction, let's say licensed in North Dakota, and I'm providing telepsychological services to someone in another jurisdiction, someone located in Idaho. Now, just out of curiosity, folks who've been paying attention today, what's one way that you could help address this concern if I am licensed one place and delivering services another place? Come on, there's 2 more chocolates. Work for the VA. Oh, he gets the fig, fennel, and almond. Yes, we could work for a federal entity that facilitates licensure mobility. We could be licensed in multiple locations, both where the person lives as well as where we are located. But in this first example, let's just presume we didn't enact one of those solutions. This would constitute an interjurisdictional practice and potentially be problematic for us. A second scenario, licensed in one jurisdiction, providing telepsychological services from a non-licensed jurisdiction to someone in the licensed jurisdiction. So let's say I'm licensed in North Dakota, but I go on a delightful vacation to Sun Valley. And in the interim while I'm gone, although I've arranged for coverage, there's something specific to my client that comes up, and the person who is covering my cases reaches out to me. Or let's say my client somehow has a mechanism, they got my mobile phone number, there's an email, comes through something, something that maybe wasn't the way I hoped that technology would be used, but I am aware of my client being in crisis. In that moment, if I elect to pick up my phone from my lovely hotel room in Sun Valley, I'm very committed to going there now, and I pick up the phone and I call my client back in North Dakota, I'm actually engaged in an interjurisdictional practice. Even though I am licensed in North Dakota and my client is sitting in North Dakota, there's a potential problem there. Let's say something about that communication goes awry and the client then has a complaint against me, takes it to the board of North Dakota. Well, in North Dakota, we know that they do regard care as occurring in North Dakota, where the client was sitting. However, there is an issue that I was delivering care from somewhere I wasn't licensed. And let's say, just to keep going with it, let's say the board took another position, the position that care occurs where the provider was seated. Well, let's say then if that client had a complaint against me, that care didn't even occur in North Dakota, so to speak. So you can imagine how it gets very confusing very quickly when we start going across these interjurisdictional boundaries. Number 3, a license in one jurisdiction providing telepsychological services from another non-licensed jurisdiction to someone in yet another non-licensed jurisdiction. So let's say I'm licensed in North Dakota. I'm taking a lovely vacation to Minneapolis. I go on a lot of vacations. And my client, who lives in North Dakota, is taking a lovely vacation to Sun Valley this time. While on vacation in Sun Valley, something goes terribly wrong, wants to speak to their therapist, reaches out to me, I'm on my lovely vacation, but somehow, if we ended up being in communication, now, not only am I not licensed where I'm delivering care, I'm not licensed where the care occurs either, because again, North Dakota defines the care as occurring where the patient sits. So in this instance, it's a mess, right? There are just lots of different jurisdictions being crossed. Number 4 is my personal favorite, and one workaround, I suppose. I'm just licensed nowhere. I'm just, licensed schmeicensed. I'm not worried about it. And I'm delivering telepsychological services everywhere. And this happens. Margot, over the years, has sent me some doozy of some websites, where unfortunately, right now, really it is part of our mandate to protect the public, from some of the things going on out there. And folks who I'm going to give the best benefit of the doubt and say are well-intentioned and may not be apprised of the manner in which they are not obtaining licenses to deliver services, may run afoul of this. Do you mind? I'm sorry, do you mind repeating that?
Yeah, number 4 makes you Dr. Phil, I think.
Dr. Phil. Yes, number 4 is potentially very lucrative, I guess, yes. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I think there's a real reality that this stuff is going on, and that, certainly I don't think anyone in this room would be running out to do that, but, to be aware that these are the types of scenarios we're speaking about. This is a beautiful infographic that describes these 4 scenarios. So where's my pointer? Here we go. All right, so provider and recipient are in the same location. Let's say the provider is in the jurisdiction where they are licensed, but the recipient is away, or the provider is away, and the recipient's in the location where the provider is licensed. Everybody's away, nobody's licensed. So it's a nice sort of pictorial demonstration of what we're talking about. So these are some of the issues to consider and hopefully to resolve. We've spoken many times about this mandated reporting issue. Poor Texas, we're picking on Texas today. If I'm to understand, we're not to mess with it, Margot. But there is a notable distinction here that some states have this duty to warn, Texas does not, and it's a fairly obvious conflict if you're delivering care into Texas. That's just one example. Being thoughtful, particularly about mandated reportings around special populations, children, elderly, anyone that the law may treat as a vulnerable population. Some of the informed consent requirements may differ among jurisdiction. The consenting of minors, both for engaging in therapy, assessment, also for therapeutic relationships. Commitment proceedings not only vary by state jurisdictions, but sometimes by county. These things get very, very specific. Prescribing privileges, and particularly when we're talking about prescribing privileges for sessions conducted over telehealth. The Ryan Haight Online Pharmacy Consumer Protection Act has very specific guidance regarding, how we think about different classes of drugs that may and may not be prescribed over online services. And then tax reporting. So, if I start going into Idaho, and let's say I do the right thing, I get licensed in both places, or I'm participating in PSYPACT once it's up and running, and I am making money in Idaho, hand over fist, they'll want to know about that. I will have income reporting that needs to be done, and I want to be sure that I'm really thoughtful about those laws. Or to Tennessee. And any documentation requirements, notation requirements may differ place to place, and just so we're aware of those and making efforts to reconcile them.
So some specific considerations that we want to think about related to telepractice. We're a very rural, low population state. We'll probably earn some awards for this from time to time, and you see those kind of posts around Facebook and USA Today. We're the 19th most rural state, with kind of the largest area of all of the states. So it's interesting to me how spread out we are, yet how much in terms of our providers we are located in city/large town areas. There are 250 licensed psychologists and applied behavior analysts in North Dakota for the estimated 739,000 of us North Dakotans. So technology really is something that could be quite a cool thing for us as a profession. We have some amazing training models that are up and coming in our university graduate programs in North Dakota. And I think that's helpful in thinking ahead and to the future in terms of our practice professionals that are going to be coming into our profession in a few years, because they're learning this in grad school. Are there any graduate students here? Yay! I'm so glad. They're learning how to do this from a best practice model, and that's huge. We talked about earlier that collegial consultation that we showed our hangout for, but some of our early career psychologists are going to have way more information about this than we do, and we need to have some open-mindedness in that regard and not be scared off by this new technology that's kind of invading our practice. Especially in North Dakota, it can bring us and services to communities and partner with professionals in those communities that we've not been able to do historically. I love the idea of driving a bus around or a motorhome. That's pretty cool. I think UND actually has a medical program where they do that, but how neat it would be for us to add a mental health component. I see the faculty nodding in the back. Yay. Certainly, we have been cutting edge with some of the professionals that we have in our community. I'm thinking of NRI specifically that has done a lot of work with devices and technology and telepractice for quite some time. That's been presented here at NDPA several years ago. So it's not new for us, but it's new in how we're thinking about it, and it's new in how we're thinking about integrating it into our practice world. And in North Dakota, we do have some flexible state regulations that actually, in the world of regulation, are quite forward-thinking compared to some of our counterparts around the country who say, no, you can't do this even within your state. Wow, okay. Just kind of means there's a lot more change that needs to happen in those jurisdictions before we can even do telepractice within the boundaries of that jurisdiction. things we want to think about for our providers, and that really is that competency of practice, not just in terms of what you're doing in your psychological aspect of practice, in the clinical work that you do, but also as you're integrating that technology. And you're here today gaining that competence and start to know, what do I need more information on? How can I kind of go home and take this stuff with me and figure out what my task list is, how I can do that risk assessment so I know what I need to focus on. We want to think about continuing educational implications. A lot of continuing ed is online these days. That's pretty cool, really. Some of that's through coursework, through universities. Some of that's webinars, like we're taping today. Very cool. But continuing education requirements in various jurisdictions mean you have to pay attention to what counts for that. In North Dakota, you have 20 hours of online webinar kind of education that you're allowed to count towards that renewal. In Minnesota, all 40 of your renewal CEs can be done online. So it's just an example of how that changes jurisdiction to jurisdiction. As I mentioned, the individual earlier who had a numerous amount of licenses. This is why he needed to have an administrative assistant dedicated to understanding all the CEs he needed to gain and what category they needed to be in order for him to be compliant with his license renewals. There are a lot of administration considerations that we want to think about if we're entering into telepractice, and some of those are the fundamental things we've talked about earlier today. Some of those are also just, how do we keep track and let folks know when we're entering a different jurisdiction, what do we need to be aware of in that administrative capacity? We want to think about investing in compliant office technologies. You know, just because Skype is available, just because the client knows how to use it, just because they're agreeable and the risks don't seem all that bad, doesn't mean we should do that, right? We want to be mindful and really consider and document well what our reasoning is clinically for making that leap to something that might not seem like maybe the best practice strategy. It might be the best practice strategy in that particular situation, but the next client, it might not be the best practice strategy. We want to think about what the market opportunities are, and we want to think about our professional collaborative partnerships, because those are important. We don't want to lose that. In fact, technology can help us build that even more strongly. You know, I find it much easier to make referrals to folks now because I have connection with them via email or an instant messaging where I can get their phone number right away. Okay, well, here it is. My client that I need to make a referral to can leave the office with that information today. So there's lots of ways that our partnerships can build through technology.
A little earlier today, we spoke about PSYPACT. PSYPACT having been announced by ASPPB only just 2 months ago, and it's really very, very exciting. You know, you'll note peppered throughout our talk today are the message support PSYPACT. You know, and I think that both Margot and I really we're really excited about this announcement and really excited for this as a model for how to think about interjurisdictional work. PSYPACT, as we mentioned earlier, essentially is this interstate compact that would facilitate temporary interjurisdictional practice between clients and providers where the state where the client and provider are affiliated with are members of the pact. So, for example, if I am a North Dakotan licensed in North Dakota on my glamorous vacation to Sun Valley in Idaho, and I did want to get back in touch, you know, and my client is on a vacation to Idaho and has that terrible thing happen while they're on vacation, and I wanted to be in touch with them while they're on the vacation. Well, if Idaho and North Dakota are members of the PSYPACT, that would facilitate a brief, you know, episode of care that occurs over a distance. I mean, for me, one of the most exciting things about this, and Margot, I'll look to you if you have anything you want to add, is that this is a very compelling and interesting model. I mean, we've never had anything like this before, some sort of interstate licensing model to facilitate how to handle these issues. And I really think we'll look to this as, a bellwether for how to think about these things. And I really encourage folks to get behind this and support this because, when we do this well, I think there's the opportunity for this to be a template to think about these issues on a larger scale, even larger scale, though this is pretty large scale.
I think I would just add to that this is coming right on the cusp of the Federation of Medical Boards announcing a compact process for fast-tracking medical licensure in a mobile jurisdiction. So this is really a federal kind of process that both the medical world as well as the psychological world from a professional standpoint is starting to engage in. And I think for that reason, there's likely a lot faster track to adopting this. It's not going to be an overnight process by any stretch of imagination. But if the medical boards are going around the country asking legislators and states' attorneys to review this stuff, now we're kind of coming on the coattails. And this isn't we don't have to pave the way for something hugely new. The medical board's just been there. So we have a nice way of kind of segueing into this. Kind of a sidestep from that, psychology from the ASPPB organization received a grant, and only medicine and psychology received this grant from the government to look at professional survey. How many licensed psychologists are there in the country? We don't know the answer to this question. We don't know how many licensed doctors there are in this country. We have some estimates, but from both a standpoint of we're in a lot of need of mental health care and we're an underserved professional group trying to provide it, the government is paying really close attention to psychology as a profession. And so with that in mind, having mobility and portability of licensure is a gigantic, important factor that we want to consider and help promote within our profession. So.
Margot and I used to always speak about how both of us had sort of heard this urban legend, that you could practice anywhere for 30 days. And I think it's really smart that we're starting off with a 30-day interstate compact, because lots of us thought it was true already. So, right? I mean, we have to get behind it. It will just confirm that confirmation bias. All right. Anyway, I think it's a really great thing. I'd encourage you to visit this site here, take a look at the specific language, think a little bit about how this could apply to you. I mean, personally, I feel like this has applied to me many times. The client's gone on vacation, something's happened, they've traveled, visited family. There's been an instance where I would really like to reach out to them, and I'm put in a bind. Ethically, I think it is the right thing for me to be in touch with them, but, logistically, I'm concerned. Am I practicing outside my licensure jurisdiction? And this, I think, is a nice way for us to be doing the ethical thing in a way that is governed correctly. Okay. So the future. The future is wide open. I think this is a really exciting time, and it's an exciting time to be thinking about how technology informs our practice. North Dakota is an exciting place to be doing it. I think the environment is exactly right for doing this type of technology-enabled outreach. In other parts of our lives, Margot and I both sort of wear different hats where we are working with entities that develop new types of therapies using technology, virtual reality exposure therapies, interactive mobile applications that help advance psychoeducation outside the treatment room. I think that really this is an incredibly exciting time to be a psychologist, a little bit scary, but also an incredibly unprecedented opportunity about how we can be bringing these tools into our practice. And I think North Dakota, more than many places, is a very ripe place to be doing that work.
And just as we can be bringing that into our practice, and there's some fantastic tools and applications to do that, equally important is our current abilities, and I'll speak from a Department of Defense example, where they're sending holographic therapists out into the front lines to help provide services and mental health needs on the front line. This is amazing combination of Disney and Department of Defense that has come together to provide a service that's much needed but really no therapist is necessarily wanting to traverse. So there's lots of ways we can move our services from our office setting out to community of people in great need.
I find the therapy avatars all too comforting. It's concerning for job security.
So.
Okay. So, we've had a long day together today, so we're hoping to create some space to talk about any questions you may have, idiosyncratic to your practice, or perhaps just clarifying something we've spoken about already.
Since we are close to Canada, I was wondering about, since we're close to Canada and other states, I was wondering about, I'm assuming this isn't a problem yet, but you don't know when you're online which server is being used. I mean, you could send something or go to a website and it's being bounced off of something in Timbuktu. Is that going to be, is that a problem? Also, when you're closer to the border, you don't know when your cell calls are utilizing a Canadian cell tower and other things. Is that a problem?
I can speak to the Canada question. For whatever reason, the Canadian government has had a very large determination over internet domain in Canada. And so it would surprise me that those transmissions across state lines aren't being monitored and or deferred elsewhere. There's a lot of concern of Canadian government in terms of what's accessible by US government, who monitors everything on the internet. And if we go back far enough to think about how the World Wide Web was developed, it was developed by the American government so they could monitor information. So that's not paranoia, that really is part of how that's developed. In terms of cell towers, it's generally you can have some information on your cell phone when it's being bounced to a tower outside your roaming area, but you do have to have that enabled so you're aware of that, and you end up with a large fancy charge if you don't from the cell towers outside of your area and or the US. So you do want to be very careful about that, but how you have knowledge of that varies depending on what the carriers are.
And I would add, and please, Margot, correct me if you know otherwise, I know of no precedent in which someone's gotten in trouble for this. I mean, I sort of feel like, by my way of thinking, if a complaint came to a board, if there was some sort of legal thing that was pursued, always the question is, did we do what was reasonable, what was within your control? It's truly outside your control. I mean, the idea that I shouldn't call that patient, I might be close to the Canadian border, I have a hard time believing we'd be held culpable for that. I mean, I'm not the law, obviously, but I'm aware of no one ever having an issue of that nature. I think it's a great question.
In your view, is North Dakota likely to become one of the states to participate in PSYPACT? And how could we, as licensed psychologists, then join that network?
That's a fantastic question. I would say yes. There's probably a high likelihood that we could be one of those first adopting states for a number of reasons. We're small, we've got great connections with our legislative counterparts, and we're kind of forward-thinking folk. With that said, I think what the committee is going to be looking at when they're rolling this out is communities of connected jurisdictions that have a lot of interconnection. So they're probably going to look to the Northeast because that's a much larger issue for them than it is for us. However, we're small, we have a comparatively large voice in government, and so we're a good candidate for that. How can we advocate for that? Letting the board know in North Dakota, letting ASPPB know. That's something you can have connection with, even though you're a licensee and not a regulatory board member. And how do you get involved with that? Read the document. You'll find out what some of the requirements are in terms of what you need to do as a licensee and what that process is going to be. This probably is going to be a 2 to 5 year process. It's not an overnight thing. And from a telepsychology standpoint, there are going to be some requirements regarding what you need to demonstrate. You need some education about telepsych practices, you need some CEs, and you're going to need some documentation regarding that competency. So great question.
And you've just attended a seminar on telepsychology, so well done.
Other question? We filled your brains with all we know. Awesome.
Well,
Was this worth your time? Great. If you do have questions in our materials consistently, you've got our email contact. We're happy to visit with you. That's probably the easiest way to reach us, but leave us your number and we can always give you a call in person. We really, really are thrilled to be here today, and thank you all for participating and helping us put this on.
thank you so much.